Good afternoon, everybody. Well, at least it's afternoon for me in rainy, I was going to say sunny Bristol in the UK. I hope you can hear me okay. It would be great to see something in the chat to confirm that people are able to hear me all right, and that there are no problems. Today, I'm talking about some of my research that I've done recently. That really presents quite an interesting perspective of government communications for behaviour change and social engagement that may present some ways of thinking about communicating physical activity and other health behaviour change imperatives to more disadvantaged and excluded groups. I particularly take a moment to think about the UK government's presentation of physical activity and weight loss social marketing, which they do through their campaign called Better Health, and think about how this has the potential to exclude mothers from deprived areas, which is the target group that I'm most interested in my various research projects. So this is me. Sorry about the slightly strange formatting that Google Slides has created, but essentially my name's Fiona Spotswood and I'm a social marketing researcher at the University of Bristol in the School of Management, particularly interested in physical activity research. And I focus on the organisation of everyday life to understand how particularly leisure time physical activity and physical activity more generally can fit into everyday life and be supported by intervention efforts and policy efforts. And I have a particular interest, given my background, in social marketing and critical social marketing. So I guess the objectives of my presentation today are to think about a practice theory informed approach to understanding how mothering and leisure time physical activity interact, and the support that we need from a government, from a communications, from a social marketing perspective, the support that we need to encourage mothers in deprived urban environments to engage in leisure time physical activity. And I particularly, as I said, focus on the UK government's approach to encouraging physical activity through their Wake Up social marketing efforts through the Better Health campaign. And I use this as a starting point for thinking about alternative perspectives. So physical activity and lockdown from COVID-19, what do we know? So the first major lockdown in the UK, Sport England covered the whole of lockdown through research, trying to understand the disruption it was having in people's physical activity. They found that there was massive disruption of physical activity behaviours, that adult physical activity reduced to a lower level than before, and that reduction in people who were using physical activity to manage their health and their mental well-being was pretty stark, even though people agreed they did have more time to be physically active. And there was also a reduction in people who were intending to increase their physical activity. But more importantly than this, from my perspective and my interest in mothers, is that there was a particular dip in women's physical activity levels, and particularly people in low incomes found it harder than normal to become active during the COVID-19 outbreak. There was a gradual fall in people agreeing on the importance of physical activity, and a gradual reduction in the people who found the government messages to be encouraging of their physical activity, despite the fact that for the first time, really, we were seeing politicians on a national platform talking about your daily physical activity, your daily hour of activity, even at the heart of lockdown. And for me, particularly interesting is that lower socioeconomic groups have seen a reduction in physical activity levels, much more so than the higher income groups. In the context of this, and particularly because of Boris Johnson, our UK Prime Minister's own experience of physical activity, his own experience of COVID-19, and he was very, very unwell and was in intensive care. And he reflected that his overweight and his lack of healthiness, his lack of physical activity, made it more difficult for him to recover. And in the light of this, he's launched a campaign, a social marketing effort to try and encourage people in the UK to wake up and quit smoking, lose weight, and get active. Now, this campaign has a number of different elements to it: Couch to 5K programs, apps supporting 10 minutes of physical activity a day, tips and advice on moving more, getting into good habits, rewarding those good habits. There are NHS fitness studios and a number of different partnerships with paid for interventions supporting physical activity, as well as a whole raft of different interventions targeting healthier eating and smoking cessation. But the general tone of this campaign is of great interest to me, based on my recent and ongoing research with mothers of preschool children in deprived areas of cities in the UK. The Better Health campaign that the UK government is running focuses on a wake up and fight mentality. Unfortunately, I can't share this link, but in your own time, you can perhaps copy and paste this link and have a look at the video, which is a real call to arms for people to wake up, reset, restart, kickstart, more, different, better, get up, shake up. It's very directive, it's very demanding. And as a woman in the research I'm doing at the moment pointed out to me, there's no one in that video with children. Although there are different bodies, different shapes, different levels of fitness and health featuring in that video, there is nothing that resonates with mothers of preschool children who've been hit really hard by the first and indeed the ongoing lockdown, and the extent to which they are constrained by the organisation of their everyday lives, the fact they are stuck at home and with their children and cannot access physical activity in the same way as other groups. So what interests me is the inequality of the starting point. The government's assumption is that this is a chance for us to wake up, to start taking responsibility, to fight COVID-19 collectively as a nation through our engagement with physical activity. That COVID-19 and the first lockdown was a chance for a fresh start. And actually, my research shows the opposite. It shows that for many mothers in deprived areas of cities in the UK, this is COVID-19 and lockdown has not created a fresh start. It has created another layer and level of constraint. And so what I have done in my research is illuminate the way that everyday life for mothers in the UK is organised. Mothers on a low income in urban areas with preschool children particularly, and how the organisation of their everyday lives creates the conditions or prefigures the conditions for their engagement in leisure time physical activity. And I argue that focusing on the routines of everyday life for mothers shows us something different about how governments should and could engage with these particular groups, and shows us the limitations and dangers of treating everybody as though they are all ready for this fresh start that COVID-19 seems to have supposedly has provided us. So the research that I'll be talking through for the next 10-15 minutes comes from two qualitative research projects I've been engaged with this year and last year. The first was an extensive set of interviews with mothers in deprived parts of Bristol, starting in autumn of last year, that focused on the temporalities of mothering. So the time landscape, the temporal landscape, and the way that mothering is organised in a way that really has very little to do with choice, very little to do with the agency of mothers, but is structured very tightly by the practices that mothers are engaged with, and by the practices of other people, institutions, and organisations that intersect with everyday lives for mothers. And the second project is ongoing. When I wrote these slides, we had done 13 online interviews with mothers in deprived parts of Bristol. We've actually done more than that now. We're approaching 20. And these interviews are discussing and exploring mothers' feelings about lockdown, what happened, how they've affected those temporal landscapes and the structuring of their everyday lives, and how they feel going into the next phases of the pandemic, which is intermittent lockdowns, calls for health, calls for physical activity from a government that wants people to be healthy, but in the context of what's going on in their everyday worlds. So I draw together these ideas with a practice approach. So although I'm a social marketer, I'm interested in how we can use marketing ideas, tools, techniques for social change, for social good. I'm interested in using insights from practice theory. So although social marketing is really well established, with a great evidence base that can engage individuals and communities and upstream stakeholders in collaborative working for creating conditions for social change, it has tended to focus on downstream behaviours, and it has tended to be critiqued for its emphasis on attitudes and intentions. Whereas practice theorists, particularly those from a sustainability world, but also increasingly those from physical cultures research and from a health and sociology of health and illness set of traditions, practice theorists are much more interested in the configurations of everyday life, the mundane aspects, the things that people have little choice over, and where choice is less relevant than the repeated performances of shared and collective social practices. And I always draw on the example of having breakfast and how we don't really need to think about breakfast and what foods to eat. We know what foods are appropriate. We know what time of day to eat breakfast. We know how it works. We don't need to look it up or ask anybody or give it very much thought. We do the same thing every day in roughly the same order. We shower, we wake, we shower, we dress, we have breakfast, we leave the house, or these days we go upstairs to our spare room and crack on with our daily work. We understand these things at a very tacit, unreflexive level. So practice theory emphasizes those persistent everyday patterns of action, the unreflexive nature of much of our activity, the habituation, which really does color very much of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And this is a really useful perspective for social change and for governments trying to communicate and achieve social change, because it doesn't responsibilize individuals and doesn't claim that individuals have the entire answer to achieving behavior change. It does accept the fact that individual behaviors and choices happen within a context which is wider and includes socio-cultural forces which individuals are part of, which they contribute to, but which are very much a picture of what goes on an everyday basis. So the language of social practices, of practice theory, can illuminate how everyday life is configured and highlight really important and interesting approaches to intervention, which might otherwise be missed with different theoretical lenses, focusing much more on a behaviorist perspective. So the first piece of research that I would like to draw on is, as I mentioned, about mothering temporalities. And this illuminated to me very clearly the unequal starting points that mothers with preschool children, with babies, face in the light of COVID-19 and in the light of calls from government to get involved in physical activity, to lose weight, to wake up, to shake up, to get on with it. So I found that there are three interlocking temporal dimensions which colour and condition mothering and mothering possibilities. And really, a good way of thinking about these dimensions is to think about mothering as a set of actions or activities which are very dominant, which are competitive, almost predatory, and push out leisure time physical activity. So rather than thinking about mothers as not prioritizing physical activity or not being motivated to do it and requiring persuasion, think about the nature of mothering, the very inherent nature of mothering, as characterizing an everyday routine which pushes out physical activity, and it makes it not important and not fit with everyday life for mothers. So I think about this, I'll skip on to the next slide. I think about this in three different ways. First of all, you've got the external practices which aren't part of mothering itself, but interconnect with mothering. So mothers do a number of different activities, but those activities are connected to those people and practices and organizations outside the home, outside of the mother's everyday activities, like schools, school timetables, working timetables, workplace practices, bus timetables even cropped up, road networks, opening times of shops. All of these temporal characteristics and often distance characteristics of everyday practices interlock with mothering and make mothering happen in a certain way, in a certain order, and creates hotspots at different times of day, creates intensity in mothering, and often makes physical activity very difficult. So just one quote here, a mother told me, getting to my physical activity class kind of involved dad getting home from work, me leaving at 6. So we struggled the week before last. And in the end, I was just like, I'm not going to go. It's too stressful. So this isn't about her choice. This isn't about her motivation or her lack of priority. She's reliant on structures that are outside her own practices for this to happen. Similarly, with what I've called temporal demands, there are demands that are inherent to mothering, which make physical activity really difficult. When you do enact mothering practices, there are things that have to happen in a certain order. There are things you have to do when you are caring for your children or caring for your home that happen in a certain order, that have to happen in a certain way. And when these intersect with those external practices, which I mentioned before, which interlock and intersect with mothering, it creates stressful times and difficult focus times. And a good example is the last one here, which I've labeled hotspots and displaced practices. And lots of the mothers I spoke to explained that by 8 or by a certain time in the evening, everyone's in bed, knocked out, and then it's tidy up time for me. So whereas at that point when young children are asleep, mothers could go and engage in leisure time physical activity, they can't, because the procedures of mothering dictate that that house needs to be tidy, everything needs to be ready for the next day, and quite honestly, they're exhausted. And then finally, and very much linked to the previous temporalities I've described, we have a sense of temporal dispositions. These are expectations about what good mothering, or in some cases, super mothers, some people describe it as, what it entails. And the expectations of society are simply not that leisure time physical activity forms part of the everyday life of mothers. Good mothering means being present to care. Mothers feel this, it becomes embodied, and they describe to me feeling worried that their children are going to feel that that I have abandoned them, just left and gone off to do what I want to do. It doesn't feel right for these mothers to do physical activity. And it's not expected. As the second quote explains, physical activity is just one of those extra things that I always feel like I'm not making time for. Sometimes you just don't want to add to the stress of trying to get around to doing stuff. Mothering is predatory, it's all consuming, it's all demanding, makes physical activity very, very difficult to engage with. And I should add, and I should have said it earlier on, that when I asked mothers what counted as physical activity, what they understood physical activity to be, they did not discount the incidental physical activity that happens when they are chasing their children, when they are engaging in movement as a part of everyday life. However, they found it to be unsatisfactory, and they craved leisure time physical activity for themselves, doing something that they enjoyed, doing the things that the government want them to do, engaging in fitness classes, doing yoga, running around the park, taking the dog for a walk. They wanted those things. So this isn't a matter of choice or desire. These are deeper, societally organized and structured phenomena which are preventing mothering from including leisure time physical activity. So these, thinking about the routines, the temporalities of mothering, illuminates the inequality and almost the impossibility of mothers looking at that Better Health campaign from the UK government and seeing possibility, seeing inspiration there, seeing something that they can take and understand to be their own. It limits their agency to take part in physical activity, despite their desires, despite choice, despite their attitudes. It reduces the viability of an attitude-oriented campaign simply because the socio-structures of their lives prevent and condition the possibility that physical activity is a reality for them. And therefore, it increases a likelihood that mothers will become disengaged from these leisure time physical activity campaigns, that the This Girl Can campaigns, that the Better Health campaigns, the Wake Up, Shake Up, Let's All Do This Together campaigns will disengage mothers because they will continue to feel like physical activity is not for people like them, and that other people's lives can contain and include leisure time physical activity, but for them it's just not possible. And the second piece of research that I will talk about for literally 2 to 3 minutes extended this initial idea about leisure time physical activity and the possibilities being conditioned by the everyday lives of mothers and mothering practices. And it has focused specifically on this post-lockdown era. I say post-lockdown era, the UK is currently in lockdown again, but the research itself started before the current lockdown, which is a short, hopefully short few weeks lockdown, and is continuing throughout this period. So the first 6 months of extreme constraints on our behaviour from because of COVID was over. The research started, and this research explores how mothers feel about their bodies and how their bodies are inscribed with socio-cultural and political histories, which create and explain that this sense of unequal starting point when these women are engaging or thinking about engaging with physical activity. And the research has found that mothers hate their bodies. And this is nothing to do with lockdown. This is an inherent sense of relationship with their physicality, with their embodied selves, which happened long before lockdown. They feel their bodies let them down. They feel their bodies are immobile, they are disabled, they are overweight. They are mothers' bodies, they are not bodies that belong to them, their sense of self. Their bodies might be owned by their children, they're demanded by their children, and they feel strained and they feel stressed as a result. They feel that this sense of leisure time physical activity is not for people like them, it is for others. And the best quote probably that sums this up is a woman we interviewed a few weeks ago who said, "I don't go to these classes. I have never engaged with these classes since I've been a mother because I don't want to be the knackered donkey at the back." And someone else said, "I feel like all the skinny people are going to stare at me and they're going to judge me." So in terms of how these women are feeling about lockdown, post-lockdown, and the government imperative to get active and wake up and get engaged in leisure time physical activity, there's a sense of 4 factors, I think, which colour their experience of this post-lockdown period. First of all, you have disconnection and claustrophobia. Then you have disruption and uncertainty. You have fear, and you have this sense of an unhealthy lockdown body. So these quotes kind of say it all. In terms of disconnection and claustrophobia, this mother said, "You've had enough of it. You sort of wake up and go, if I have to stare at these 4 walls and your face one more day, I'm going to go insane. But obviously you love each other. No one's come to harm. You're just like, I need to see someone else's face." And this was a sense, and this creates an important context for the opportunities as well, I think, for government communications around physical activity. claustrophobia. There is a sense of claustrophobia. There's a sense of disruption and uncertainty. All the stuff they would normally do, suddenly they couldn't access it. And their children struggled and the mothers struggled as well and found it really tiring. And this mother here in the bottom left-hand corner says, both of us were knackered is the term, feel a bit fried kind of thing. There was also an infusion of fear throughout this. People said, I couldn't go out. I walked my dogs in peace. I could go out. I walk my dogs in peace and not be bothered by anybody. I really like that. But then in the next breath, it's quite frightening. My husband's classed as vulnerable, and that makes things a little bit more wary. And that's at the back of your mind all the time. So people are not emerging from COVID with a sense of freshness, with a sense of opportunity. They are exhausted, they are knackered, they are feeling claustrophobic, they are fried, they are fearful. And as a result of all of this, and because of their pre-existing mothering relationship with their bodies, they feel unhealthy. This woman in the top right said, I feel like history's repeating itself in the fact that I was active, then I got pregnant, then I ballooned from a size 8 to an 18, then I got down to a 10 or 12, then I got pregnant again, and now I'm back at a 16, and I know it's kind of getting me down. So lockdown has not created a fresh start for these women. Lockdown has created another layer of constraint, which has coloured and conditioned the possibility that they can get engaged in leisure time physical activity. Amongst this doom and gloom, there have been glimmers of opportunity in terms of social marketing, physical activity in a post-COVID or COVID-19 world. There was a recognition in the data that physical activity is good for mental health. That message definitely has got across, and people are engaging much more in that sense of physical activity as something for mental as well as physical well-being. And there was an appreciation, a newfound appreciation for freedom and movement in lockdown, after lockdown had stopped that entirely the first time round. But governments have to understand that the context for this opportunity, the context for campaigns encouraging physical activity, is that mothers particularly their everyday lives are infused with fear, with disengagement, and with distance from the notion of physical activity and physically active people. The women I spoke to blame themselves for their low physical activity. They feel lazy and they consider others to be happy and disciplined. Women feel anxious about getting involved in leisure time physical activity. They don't want to be the knackered donkey at the back. They feel that people who engage in physical activity are others. They are skinny, they are fit, they are healthy. This is not for people like them. They feel bullied as well by the socially collective image of the perfect mother. And this is a quote from one of our interviewees. And she asks herself, why am I bullying myself like this? But it's so common when I talk to my friends. Leisure time physical activity is not accessible to these women. And that is something governments need to understand. And so when you think about the UK government's wake up approach, it dismisses the significance of the way that these mothers' lives is organised on a very mundane, everyday level, and how their everyday lives make the possibility for leisure time physical activity pushed out. And it dismisses the significance of their embodied relationships with leisure time physical activity, the fact that they don't like their bodies, they feel self-conscious, and that colours their capability and their capacity to wake up and get involved. It also responsibilises their engagement as fighting COVID-19, whereas from my data, I feel like building a stronger relationship with leisure time physical activity is a better approach. That would take a longer term approach, perhaps by tackling those socio-cultural conditions and connections which infuse these mothers' lives from a very early age. And so I feel that governments should focus more on how leisure time physical activity should be built into everyday life for these inactive groups, rather than assuming that we're all at a point where we can take this COVID-19 experience as a fresh start to build better habits. And we can use a practice theory starting point to focus less on people, their motivations and their priorities, and more on the organisation of everyday life, which colours our relationship with leisure time physical activity. Now, that was an absolute whistle-stop tour through some really quite complex ideas, but I really hope that I've presented a different picture. I listened to Rowena Merritt's fantastic talk earlier on about the opportunities that COVID-19 has created for communicating or marketing different behaviours in different contexts. And I presented a very different perspective, which questions and critiques the way that governments communicate the possibility for physical activity and indeed other social behaviours in the context of people's everyday lives and experiences. So thank you for your time.